Now I come to my fourth threat, which is serious and not funny. It's the behavior of the police force. Even when higher courts are on the side of writers and artists, the police side with the gundas who harass them. They just look on. I'll give you two examples. There could be many others. James Lane, who was an American historian, wrote a scholarly book on Shivaji, in which, without endorsing it, he passed on a tale which disputed Shivaji's parentage. This was enough for the book to be banned, for the Bhandarkar Institute, where Lane had done some of his research, to be vandalized, whereupon a case was filed among the few people who stood up at that time, and he was a very brave and remarkable Maharashtrian Indian liberal, now dead, was Dilip Chitre, who stood up against Islamic fundamentalists, Hindu fundamentalists, Maharashtrian fundamentalists, whatever. And a case was filed by some of these liberals in the Bombay High Court, which overturned the ban. But the OUP, which was the publisher, and I think one of the representatives somewhere here, was too scared to stock the book because the police would not give them protection. You could get dozens of examples. It would happen anywhere. It would happen in any state. Congress ruled, BJP ruled, Trinamool Congress ruled, AIDMK ruled, whatever. CPM ruled, whatever. The fifth threat, which is again linked to this, is the pusillanimity and occasionally malevolence of Indian politicians. No major Indian politician, no major Indian political party, I would amend that, no major or minor Indian politician, no major or minor Indian political party has ever consistently supported writers, artists, and filmmakers against thugs and bigots. Politicians bow down before bigots and sometimes use state power to bully editors and journalists. There are phone calls made often to proprietors by powerful politicians. There are one or two exceptions to this in terms of media houses, but I let that pass. But anyone who writes for the newspapers knows this. So that's the fifth threat. The sixth threat is linked again to the fifth, the dependence of the media on government advertisements. And this is particularly acute in the regional and the sub-regional press. If I'm running a Kannada newspaper in Dharwad, dealing with local issues, right? Bidli, Sadak, Pani, governance, and corruption, development, Hindu-Muslim harmony, the rights of Dalits. Inevitably, I depend quite a lot on the ads provided by the government of Karnataka for tenders, for jobs. And if I'm critical of a local MLA or local minister, these ads will be pulled. This is particularly acute in the case of the regional and sub-regional press, the dependence of the media on government advertisements, which makes them, which impedes them in being frank and fearless in their scrutiny of government policy, state government policies. The seventh threat, which operates more at the level of large Hindi newspapers like Dainik Bhaskar, Dainik Bhaskar, Dainik Jagran, or large English newspapers like Hindustan Times, Times of India, and so on, is the dependence of the media on commercial advertisements. Of course, this applies even more to television. These newspapers and television channels, Times Now, CNN, IBN, India Today, Aaj Tak, ABP News, which cater to people like us in this room, relatively affluent middle-class audiences, their dependence on commercial advertisements is a serious curb on the freedom of expression that their reporters or their editors or their writers or their columnists can exercise. Companies that make products which may have damaging effects are rarely criticized for fear that ads will be pulled. Not only notoriously thin-skinned companies like the Reliance, but even the Tatas, who are professedly the most professional and non-partisan of Indian corporate houses, have been known to pull ads from the media channels that run well-researched stories that may be critical of some of or some of these companies' actions or products or activities. And a field in which this has happened, in which I know, a field I know particularly well, is environmental journalism. Mr. Vajpayee was kind enough to mention my work, early work in environmental history. And that was inspired by a generation of remarkable environmental journalists, such as the late Anil Agarwal, Kalpana Sharma, Daryl De Monte, Usha Rai, Shekhar Pathak and Kuvan, these are all in English, Shekhar Pathak and Kuvan Prasoon and Rajkumar Keswani in Hindi, all quite remarkable writers. Kuvan Prasoon and Shekhar Pathak did the best work on Chipko Andolan. Rajkumar Keswani, as Ashok Vajpayee will know, exposed the Bhopal gas leak. Quite extraordinary writers in Indian languages and in English. They really pioneered the environmental movement in India. And in the 80s, they were given space. From the 90s onwards, with economic liberalization, there was pressure. As late as 1995, every major Indian newspaper had an environmental correspondent. By the time the 21st century dawned, these had either been laid off or redesignated stock market correspondents. So the pressure exercised because of the dependence on commercial ads, is an inhibiting factor in critical analysis of companies. Now, I've given you 7 threats, and I'm going to just refresh your memory before I come to my last threat. The first threat to freedom of expression in India is the retention, and in the case of the First Amendment, the consolidation of archaic colonial laws that have no place in a self-styled democracy. The second threat, imperfections in our judicial system, particularly the readiness of lower courts to entertain frivolous or malevolent petitions. The third threat, the rise and further rise of identity politics. The fourth threat, the behavior of the police force who are complicit in attacks on writers and artists and filmmakers. The fifth threat, the pusillanimity of politicians. The sixth threat, the dependence of the media, particularly the regional media and the sub-regional media on government ads. The seventh threat, the dependence of the media, particularly the big media, the corporate media, on commercial ads. And this brings me to my last threat, which we have to look within. The eighth threat to freedom of expression in India is constituted by careerist or ideologically driven writers, artists, and filmmakers. George Orwell once said, "A writer must never be a loyal member of a political party." To which I would add the amendment, a writer or artist or filmmaker must never be even a disloyal member of a political party. Tragically in India, too many writers, scholars, editors identify with a single party, or even more tragically, with a single politician, thus twisting or suppressing facts in what they write or print. This betrayal occurs across the spectrum. There are writers who are propagandists for the Bharatiya Janata Party, writers who are spokesmen for the Congress, writers who are apologists for the Communist Party of India Marxist, writers who are useful idiots for the Naxalites. Sometimes this suppression takes place because of ideological bias. I can't criticize my party. Sometimes it occurs because of ideological bias. I have to be loyal to the CPM, so I won't say anything about the expulsion of Taslima Nasreen. At other times, it is caused by plain corruption. Almost every editor or proprietor in India would be happy to have a Rajya Sabha seat, or if not that, at least subsidized government accommodation in Lutyens, Delhi. So, but the corruption is easy. The corruption is ubiquitous in our society. I'm more concerned about the ideological biases. And I think that is what is tragic about, and it's not just true of journalists, it's true of writers, it's true of filmmakers, they identify with particular politicians, particular parties, out of party loyalty. I mean, I think the Taslima Nasreen case is particularly shameful, and the left's silence on this and the acquiescence in it. The most prominent left-wing intellectuals of the city, who are always, at dharna at the top of a hat. M.F. Hussain, they will protest. Good, I applaud that. But Taslima Nasreen, they will not protest. I think this is the kind of ideological biases that have deeply damaged our own profession. I mean, if we want freedom of expression for writers or for artists or filmmakers, we should defend the freedom of expression of a writer or an artist or filmmaker to whom we are otherwise ideologically or personally or whatever viscerally opposed. Now, I have outlined 8 threats to freedom of expression. These singly and collectively undermine India's democratic credentials. Certainly, our writers, artists, and filmmakers enjoy far greater freedoms than their counterparts in semi-totalitarian countries like China or Russia. If I was a Chinese intellectual, I could not be giving this lecture in Beijing. If I was a Russian intellectual, and I've named all kinds of people. So clearly, we are freer than many countries in the world, Vietnam, Cuba, Singapore, Russia, Ukraine, whatever. But we are distinctly unfree. Writers, artists, filmmakers in India are freer than their counterparts in totalitarian countries like China or Russia, but we are distinctly unfree when compared to our counterparts in thoroughbred democracies like Sweden or Canada. That's, I think, a point I would like to underline. I'd like to end with a question which clearly has been on my mind, it's been on some people's mind. Is the situation worse today than it was in the past? Clearly, there was no golden age. Jawaharlal Nehru and B.R. Ambedkar and Vallabhbhai Patel introduced the First Amendment. Indira Gandhi's record you all know with the emergency. Rajiv Gandhi banned satanic verses. The left has played, as I've said, extremely reactionary part when it comes to freedom of expression. Are we worse off today than we were before May 2014? I want to end with that question. I believe there was no golden age. There were always these 8 threats operating in varying degrees of severity. But today, we may be marginally worse off. And I'm going to outline two reasons why I think India today is less free when it comes to freedom of expression than it was 2 or 3 or 5 years ago. The first has to do with the fact that the threats to writers, artists, and filmmakers are no longer restricted to the banning of books or the burning of books or the censoring of films or the vandalizing of artworks. Now, writers and artists are actually killed for their views, physically assassinated. 3 examples are that of Dabolkar, Narendra Dabolkar, and Govind Pansare in Maharashtra, and of course, M.M. Kalburgi in my home state. Now, these vary. Dabolkar was killed when the Congress was in power in Maharashtra and in the center. Pansare was killed when the BJP was in power in Maharashtra and the center. Kalburgi was killed when the Congress was in power in Karnataka and the BJP was power in the center. But this was a qualitatively new thing, the physical assassination of writers. In my view, there are 2 other similarities. One, which is reasonably obvious, is that Dabolkar, Pansare, and Kalburgi were particularly reviled by Hindu fundamentalists. And it's very likely, you can't be sure, that the assassins belong to that political point of view, which makes India a tragic mirror of Bangladesh, where Islamic fundamentalists are killing independent-minded writers and artists and filmmakers. So that's one aspect of those murders. The other aspect, which I urge you to reflect on, what unites Dabolkar, Kalburgi, and Pansare is that not one of them wrote in English. I may be tempting fate here, but I still like to say it. Writers in English are relatively safer than writers in Indian languages. Partly because they may have an international reputation to protect them, partly because their views don't influence voting behavior. So that's the first way in which things may be slightly worse. 3 is not a large number. In Bangladesh, it's probably 30 or 40 or 60. In China, it will be in the hundreds, either purged or sent to death camps or to gulags. In Russia, Soviet Russia, it would have been thousands. So 3 is not a very large number, but it's there. Journalists are also there. If I was to add journalists to this, we're talking about writers, established writers, but attacks on journalists. I haven't talked very much about it. I talked about let me just add a caveat, because I talked about environmental journalism. The areas of India that are most unfree are the mining districts. Bellary in my home state, Bastar in Madhya Pradesh, in Orissa, Jharkhand. This is where the rule of law does not prevail at all. And In the past, it was lucrative minerals like iron and bauxite that led to this kind of thing. Now sand mining, river mining, and the journalists write about it. In MP, in Karnataka, there have been attacks and threats. So this is a trend that is increasing. I mentioned only the prominent writers. But the vulnerability of journalists, I think we are, when I checked last, I think we are ranked 130th on the Press Freedom Index. Right. Now, so that's the first way in which we may be worse off. I'd say even before the BJP came to power, it's the last 5 or 10 years, 10, 15 years, we've been, probably this has increased. Physical attacks, not just censorship or having books burnt, but actually the elimination of writers and artists and journalists. The second way in which the situation may be worse is that the government now in power in New Delhi is arguably, or perhaps not even arguably, indubitably, the most anti-intellectual and Philistine ever to rule this country. And I say this advisedly. I mean, look at the appointments. The question is not, why Smriti Irani was made education minister. Why did she hold that job for 2 years? I mean, if you talk, I say this with anguish. Again, I said that as a writer in English, I am somewhat insulated from threats because I write in English and I may have an international reputation. As a person who does not teach in an Indian university, I am also insulated from the harassment and intimidation by Philistine ministers in Delhi. But if I look at my colleagues in my own university, the University of Delhi, or in the IITs, and the stories I hear of how they are treated by ministers and bureaucrats. I have a new book coming out next week in which my lecture today will be one of the essays. But there's also an essay in that book which asks, where are the conservative intellectuals in India? And I say this with some anguish. I'm a liberal. I'm not a leftist. I'm not a rightist. I'm a liberal. But if you look at any sophisticated democracy in this world, Germany, Britain, United States, they are right-wing intellectuals who are serious and credible. And we once had that tradition. We once had that tradition. If you think of the people who clustered around C. Rajagopalachari in the Swatantra Party, if you go further back to historians like Jadunath Sarkar and Radha Kumar Mukherjee, I mean, there is a credible intellectual tradition that can call itself conservative, that emphasizes family, community, traditional ways of being, that is often rightly skeptical of hasty change and wanton disregard of institutions that have survived for a very long time. But in India, it doesn't exist. There is not a single credible conservative intellectual in India. And our public, I mean, the way in which our best institutions have been treated, the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, if you think of the harassment they faced, and some of the IITs, I think in that sense, possibly, we are slightly worse. But I would underline, only slightly worse. There was never a golden age for the freedom of expression in India. Past regimes, past parties, past prime ministers have also never stood up for freedom of expression. But it is arguably marginally worse today. 10 years ago, I called India a 50-50 democracy. I leave you today with a slightly depressing conclusion that our democratic credentials may have slipped further. We are now a 40-60 democracy. Thank you.